The Washington City archival vault was never meant to feel warm. Its concrete floors and steel-shelved corridors carried the breath of old basements, cool, metallic, and faintly touched with the odor of cellulose decay. Even the fluorescent lights seemed muted here, as though dimmed out of respect for the fragile relics they guarded. Dr. Michael Harper walked these aisles daily, but on the morning the photograph arrived, something in the air felt sharpened, expectant. The box had come not as a donation but as a legal seizure, estate remnants from the home of a recently deceased federal judge whose private storage cellar had held more than the executors expected. Inside were hundreds of glass plate negatives wrapped in brittle tissue. Most were routine, architectural surveys, courtroom portraits, early street scenes. But one was not routine at all. Michael lifted the 5x7 plate with gloved hands, holding it carefully under the angled conservation lamp. The image that slowly revealed itself was a studio portrait dated, by emulsion type and border style, to 1892. A mother and two adult daughters, African American, formally dressed, seated before a painted backdrop of a Victorian interior garden. Their expressions were steady, dignified, unadorned by theatrical sentiment. Their clothing, lace collars, pressed skirts, modest jewelry, spoke of careful pride, of a family who understood the significance of being photographed in an era that so often excluded them. It was their hands that stopped him. The mother sat with her palms pressed together, but the gesture was not prayer. Her thumbs crossed too tightly, her index and middle fingers extended in a deliberate angle requiring conscious strain. The daughters mirrored one another, each resting a hand on their mother's shoulders, but with fingers locked into shapes that no natural pose could produce. The longer Michael stared, the more the positions gathered in tension, as if the women had held these gestures for far too many seconds of exposure time, resisting even the smallest tremor. He raised his magnifying loupe. Along the negative's right edge, he noticed the faintest engraving, WCV 1892-441. At first he assumed it was a studio cataloging number, but under magnification, the characters revealed themselves as manually notched, etched with deliberate pressure, the grooves flanked by microfractures suggesting controlled scoring. Surrounding the code were additional markings, uneven ticks, shallow lines, tiny abrasions that made no decorative sense. Someone had conditioned the negative. Someone had wanted this photograph to hold more than an image. Michael carried the plate to the scanning station. The high-resolution digital capture brought out characteristics invisible to the eye. The margins contained microscopic interference patterns, evidence of layered etching, perhaps altered post-exposure. The hand positions, once peculiar, now looked almost instructional. The daughter's mirroring was too perfect, finger joints aligned at matching degrees as though following a diagram. The mother's clasp was more rigid than devotional hands ever were. He felt, unexpectedly, a chill. This was not art. And it was not a family portrait in the conventional sense. The photograph had been constructed, engineered, to record something beyond likeness. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying the enlarged projection. He had cataloged countless 19th-century images, including the subtle codes used by abolitionist photographers before the Civil War, hidden symbols and background fabrics, directional cues and props. But those systems had largely vanished after emancipation, replaced by the promise, however uneven, of official recognition. Yet here was a signal from 1892, a year when the law claimed to protect rights while bureaucracies quietly dismantled them. A year when black families migrating north found themselves entangled in new forms of exclusion disguised as regulation and clerical order. The photograph felt like testimony, silent but insistent, as though the women understood their moment would not be believed without an encoding deeper than ink or paper. He zoomed in again on the etched number, 441. A case file? A ledger entry? A registry substitute? He could not yet say. But the more he studied, the more an unspoken realization pressed itself into the quiet room. Someone had used this photograph not simply to preserve a family's likeness, but to assert their existence against the system intent on erasing it. Michael stared at the mother's hands one last time. They held their unnatural pose with a rigidity that transcended the century between them and him. A gesture of warning, or of proof. a gesture meant to endure despite those who would prefer it silently fade. Whatever story this image belonged to, he understood one thing with certainty: it had not been meant for the official archives of its time. But it had found its way into his. And somewhere behind its etched code, a buried history was waiting, deliberate, encoded, and unwilling to stay hidden. Michael summoned two colleagues whose expertise could penetrate the photograph's quiet defiance. Dr. Laura Jennings arrived first, her research on post-emancipation migration folded into worn leather notebooks filled with census rejections, contested property filings, and church ledger fragments. Moments later came Dr. Nicholas Rain, a scholar of 19th-century visual cryptographic systems, a field so narrow that most historians assumed it belonged to wartime intelligence rather than civilian life. They stood before the enlarged scan as if examining a medical anomaly. Laura spoke first, tracing a fingertip along the mother's strained clasp. By the late 1880s, Northern institutions had learned how to deny people without saying no: birth certificates lost, marriage records mysteriously missing, property claims voided because a clerk could not confirm lineage. Erasure through paperwork. Families fled north thinking they'd escaped the plantation ledger, only to discover the government kept its own gate. Nicholas leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. These hands are not devotional. They're algorithmic. He repositioned the scan to isolate the daughter's mirrored shoulder rests. Angles like these do not occur accidentally. You teach a pose like this. You rehearse it. And you hold it steady during a 10-second exposure, knowing tremor means failure. He tapped the etched code, WCV 1892-441. Someone structured a registry behind the registry. The primary figure, he nodded toward the mother, is signaling verification authority. A vouch holder. The daughter's gestures confirm lineage status. Not language. Not narrative. Categories. Laura added quietly, a community forced to authenticate itself because officials refused to acknowledge its existence. Michael felt the room tighten. They were not looking at a sentimental portrait, they were staring at evidence of a parallel infrastructure, quiet, necessary, and born from bureaucratic cruelty. What he once assumed was a decorative engraving now read as an administrative mark, a case entry in a hidden ledger designed by those who had learned the state could not be trusted. The three scholars stood in near silence, the truth settling with slow heaviness. This photograph had not merely preserved a family. It had defended them. The engraved code, WCV 1892-441, became Michael's first thread. The Washington City Vault maintained tens of thousands of dormant case references, most forgotten, many misfiled in the decades when clerks either ignored or deliberately obstructed black petitioners. When he entered the sequence into the database, the screen hesitated as though reluctant to expose what lay beneath. Then a cluster of unindexed directories appeared, subfolders linked to inheritance disputes, identity challenges, and unprocessed legal testimonies from 1890 to 1895. Only one name repeated with unsettling frequency. Clara Morris. Seamstress. Listed in Mutual Aid Society minutes, cited as a witness in contested family registries, mentioned in footnotes that read less like bureaucratic entries and more like quiet acts of resistance. Her presence surfaced again in a series of census rejections, cases in which government examiners dismissed entire households on the grounds of insufficient identity confirmation. Attached to several of these files were references to photographic substitute testimonies, a phrase that landed on Michael like a century-delayed accusation. Lawyers had once submitted portraiture in place of documents the government refused to acknowledge. Nicholas leaned over the monitor. Case 441 wasn't decorative. It was procedural. Someone expected this image to enter the courtroom. And someone expected it to be refused, Laura added, scanning a rejection memorandum dated March 1893. Look here. No recorded birth evidence. No verified lineage. Photograph insufficient. Yet the mutual aid notes show the family was known, vouched for, documented, just not in a system that recognized their humanity. The pattern formed slowly, painfully, families denied existence not by violence but by paperwork. No whip, no chain, only the quiet brutality of a clerk's pen. Michael returned to the portrait on the light table. The three women had sat still, steady, and dignified, knowing their hands carried the burden of legal proof. The etched code, the deliberate poses, the conditioned negative, all were last defenses against a system designed to unwrite them. For the first time, he felt the photograph watching him back. Not pleading, insisting. An archive of people America recorded only when it wished to deny them. The deeper Michael dug, the clearer the architecture of the hidden network became. Between 1888 and 1897, a quiet coalition had taken shape across Maryland and the Capital District: pastors, schoolteachers, community lawyers, and photographers who recognized that the state's promise of equality had calcified into a gate that swung open only for those who already belonged. They had built, piece by piece, a parallel system of identity confirmation grounded not in government ink but in community trust. At the center of this operation stood a name Michael had not expected: Nolan West, a Boston-born photographer who, in 1887, moved to Baltimore and began advertising equal-rate portrait sessions in black-owned newspapers. His work rarely appeared in mainstream archives, yet his studio was remembered in oral histories as a place where dignity was neither negotiated nor rationed. The more Michael read, the more he understood. West had not simply photographed his clients, he had enlisted them into a defensive infrastructure. Nicholas examined surviving studio records, faint and water-damaged. West standardized the encoding, he murmured. Hand signals for lineage. Shoulder positions for household status. Finger angles for confirmation categories. Each negative engraved with a case number that could pass unnoticed by white registrars. Laura found corroboration in church ledgers. Pastors documented baptisms and marriages twice, once in official books vulnerable to tampering, and again in private volumes cross-referenced with portrait codes. Teachers trained children to recognize gestures not as secrecy, but as continuity, a shield against the sudden disappearance of their names from public rolls. The network's brilliance was its visibility. Nothing hid in shadows, everything occurred in plain sight, concealed only by the blindness of those who believed black communities incapable of administrative sophistication. The coded photographs entered courts as ordinary family portraits. Only those within the circle knew that each studio session doubled as enrollment into a ledger more reliable than the state's. Michael looked again at the mother's impossible hand clasp. She was not posing. She was signing her family into existence. And the daughters, flanking her, were affirming that existence in a language authorities were never meant to read. Her name surfaced again and again, Clara Morris, until she ceased being a reference and became a presence. Michael assembled the scattered traces of her life: a Louisiana birth noted only in an illegal plantation ledger, a sale receipt listing her as domestic labor asset, a fragment of a Freedmen's Bureau file describing a woman who stitches as though memory were thread. The documents did not form a biography so much as a map of harm. Clara had been born enslaved in the early 1850s, trafficked through a debt record system that treated births as inventory. No official birth certificate. No family register. Nothing the post-war bureaucracies would later demand. When she fled north near the end of 1865, she entered a world that claimed she was free while simultaneously requiring proof she had never been allowed to possess. In Baltimore, needlework became both her livelihood and her quiet rebellion. Lace collars, hem repairs, embroidered samplers, objects that moved through black households with a familiarity the state tried to deny them. Oral accounts described her as patient, composed, and impossibly organized. Children recalled that she could remember entire family trees even when no one else possessed a single document. Michael discovered something far more revelatory. Clara had served as a vouch holder, a verification node in the parallel identity network. Mutual aid records described how she trained families to hold their hands at precise angles during long exposures, tiny positions that translated into legal meaning. She possessed instructional diagrams stitched into cloth rather than inked onto paper, so that no official raid or hostile registry review could confiscate them. But such work carried a cost. Her notes, preserved only in fragments, revealed the emotional weight she bore. If the state demands a name, we give them a face. If they erase the face, we give them the hands. But each denial takes something from us that stitching cannot restore. She documented dozens of families whose claims had been challenged, inheritance cases, marriage validations, custody disputes hinging on the fiction that their histories lacked evidence. Each photograph she guided into existence was not a portrait but a defense strategy, a final line of testimony when all other testimony had been disqualified. The mother and daughters in the 1892 plate were not anonymous subjects. They were Clara's work, her students, her witnesses, her responsibility. Tracing Clara's lineage required navigating archives that had never existed in official form. The families she assisted were often recorded only in church subregistries, pages kept in basements. Handwritten by pastors who understood their entries might one day be the only surviving evidence that a family had ever lived where they said they lived. Michael spent weeks assembling scattered fragments until, finally, a single surviving thread emerged, a baptismal entry for Clara's daughter, followed by another for a granddaughter who later migrated north. The trail ended on the outskirts of Philadelphia, in a narrow row house kept with pristine order. Maria Morris, 81 years old, opened the door with a steadiness that suggested long familiarity with researchers and the stories they carried. When Michael explained the photograph, she did not look surprised. She only nodded once, slowly, and motioned for him to sit. "I always wondered when someone would come for it," she said, disappearing into a back room. She returned holding a small wooden box bound with faded ribbon, an heirloom she described as having been passed down with instructions to never destroy it, even when we didn't understand why. Inside lay a second print of the 1892 portrait, untouched by time except for a faint warp in the mounting board. Beneath it rested an embroidered sampler, threaded in muted blues and golds, the cotton worn but intact. The design was subtle, shapes resembling flowers at first glance, but under close inspection, the petals were fingers, each arranged at deliberate angles. "My grandmother said it was a language," Maria whispered. "A way to say who we were when no one else would write it down." Michael photographed the sampler, then compared it to Nicholas's earlier tracings. The correspondences were undeniable. The mother's clasp signaled her status as a primary vouch holder. The daughter's finger angles specified lineage categories, legitimacy, dependent status, and future eligibility for claims. The mirrored shoulder touch meant something even more profound, ongoing protection through network confirmation, a communal pledge encoded in a gesture. Maria placed her hand over the sampler with extraordinary gentleness. "They wanted us to survive the forgetting," she said. And we did. The photograph, once mysterious, now spoke in full, not one message, but an entire layered ledger rendered in stillness. The exhibition took months to assemble. Conservators cleaned fractured glass negatives, archivists reconstructed fragmented legal indexes. Curators shaped a narrative that could hold both the quiet ingenuity of the encoded portraits and the brutal historical forces that made such encoding necessary. When Northern Hands, parallel ledgers, finally opened at the Baltimore Archive House of Unfiled Legacies, the line stretched down the block. Descendants, scholars, and community elders arrived carrying documents of their own, church pamphlets, brittle envelopes, handwritten notes that had survived in dresser drawers for generations. Inside, the rooms were dimly lit to protect the artifacts. Along one wall hung the restored negatives, each illuminated from behind so the etched codes shimmered faintly. Opposite them, court indexes displayed the bureaucratic refusals that had once tried to nullify the very families standing before them now. The gallery's centerpiece was the 1892 portrait, presented beside Maria's embroidered sampler. Visitors stood before it in solemn concentration, tracing the finger positions with their eyes, recognizing, not metaphorically but literally, the language of survival. Michael watched from the corner as a young woman steadied the sampler, her brow tightening. "My great-grandmother posed like this," she murmured to her father. "There's a picture of her in the church basement. I thought it was just a stiff Victorian thing." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, as if anchoring her to a lineage suddenly made visible. Laura and Nicholas joined Michael near the back of the hall. "We expected resistance," Laura said softly, "but instead people keep bringing more evidence. They've been waiting for someone to name what they already suspected." Nicholas nodded. A parallel archive doesn't vanish. It migrates. It survives in memory until someone listens. For Michael, the revelation was not merely academic. Standing before the portrait, he understood the full weight of what the three women had done. They had sat for a photograph believing it might one day defend their right to exist in records designed to erase them. More than a century later, their hands, steady, unswerving, had finally reached the audience they were meant to reach. The portrait no longer looked ordinary. It read like a declaration.